This Parsha, we of course begin with the story of Avram. So in many, many ways, it's almost the beginning of the Torah, because Bereshis, Noach, creation of the world, the flood, all of these different inyanim, but the unique history of Klal Yisrael begins with HaKadosh Baruch Hu appearing to Avram and telling him to leave his father, leave the place where he was born, leave the environment that he was familiar with, and to go to the land that Hashem is going to show him, which is, of course, Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Torah itself says very explicitly that Avram was 75 years old when HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him to leave Haran and go to Eretz Yisrael. In fact, however, the Rishonim point out that we can prove that Avraham Avinu was already in Eretz Yisrael at least 5 years earlier than that. Now, the proof is a little intricate, and that is the following. One of the events that occurs in Parsha Lecha is a very, very important event. That is the event of the bris bein hapsarim. That means the covenant of the parts. If you remember, after Avraham Avinu defeated the 4 kings that had taken Lot, right? He was fighting on behalf of the 5 kings who were much smaller against the 4 kings. So Avraham Avinu felt after such a miraculous victory, he lost all of his merits, because sometimes when you get good things in this world, maybe that pays you off for your mitzvot, and then you don't have any merits left. So God wanted to reassure him that he would still give Eretz Yisrael to his children, etc. And this is the famous scene of the covenant of the parts, in which different animals were cut up in half, and a fire, which is the Shekhinah, passed through those animals. And that was the covenant by which Hashem said, I will give Eretz Yisrael to you. But there was something very, very ominous in that covenant. He told Avraham, in fact, it's a very scary situation, it all of a sudden became dark. And Avram became weak, and Avram was falling asleep, almost unconscious. And a voice from heaven proclaimed that your children will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. And they will be slaves, and they will be persecuted for 400 years. And the nation that enslaves them I will eventually judge, and they will leave, the Jewish people will leave, Birchush Gadol, in great wealth. Now, this prophecy does not mention Egypt, does not mention all of that, but this is an allusion to the fact that before your children will get the land of Israel, there will be a servitude and a persecution in a land that is not theirs. Chazal actually say that this was a punishment for Avram asking God, how do I know we will inherit the land? God promised him already. So if he's questioning, there is this Galus Mitzrayim. Now, this is called the bris bein hapsarim, the covenant, not to be confused with bris milah, which is later. The bris bein hapsarim is the covenant that, number 1, foretold the exile and the exodus from Egypt, and number 2, created a firm covenant and promise that eventually the Jewish people will get Eretz Yisrael. Now, a little bit of chronology here. God told Avraham that your children will be enslaved in a land that is not theirs for 400 years. Now, the problem is, if you calculate how many years the Jews were actually in Egypt from the time of Yaakov coming down, and that's even before they were slaves, a good deal of the time they weren't even slaves, from the time of Yaakov coming to Mitzrayim until the Exodus in the days of Moshe is 210 years. So how do you reconcile the 210 years with the 400 years? So there's a lot of answers that are given. The answer that Rashi gives, and again, this is based on Midrashim, is God never said you're going to be 400 years in Egypt. God said you will be in a land that's not yours for 400 years. We actually count the 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak. Now, even though Yitzchak was born in Eretz Yisrael, And Yitzchak never left Eretz Yisrael. But it was like a land that was not his because everybody was harassing him. They were filling up his wells. So Ein Hachinami, we were in Mitzrayim only 210 years, but 190 years from the birth of Yitzchak. I'm sorry. The extra 190 is the birth of Yitzchak because again, let's figure this out. Yitzchak was born when Avraham is 100 years old. We're going to read this in next week's Parsha. So from the birth of Yitzchak till Yaakov came to Mitzrayim is 190. And then from Yaakov coming to Mitzrayim till Moshe takes them out is 210. 190 and 210 is considered to be 400. Okay, so according to Rashi, the 400 years is from the birth of Yitzchak. According to other midrashim, we should have been in Mitzrayim 400 years, but God had to take us out 190 years early because we had reached in that 210 years the 49th level of impurity. And had we stayed even another minute, we would have hit level 50. Level 50 is irredeemable. In fact, that's even the meaning the Arizal says, that we didn't have time to let our dough rise, we had to bake matzah. Even that amount of time would have hit level 50. So there's a big nafkamina here, two different understandings. According to Rashi, we did fulfill the 400 years by counting it from the birth of Yitzchak. According to the other midrashim, we owed Hashem a deficit. We really needed another 190 years, but Hashem had to stop the treatment because we would have hit the level 50. And there's kind of a sad note on this. In a number of Svarim it says that had we successfully completed 400 years in Mitzrayim, that galut would have eradicated all of the impurities of our soul, and we could have merited Mashiach and the Beis HaMikdash immediately. But because the chemotherapy, so to speak, had to be stopped prematurely, now there was 190 years earlier than it should have been stopped, there remained imperfections that require thousands and thousands of years of galus to be masakin. It's like compound interest. Had we finished the job in Mitzrayim, there would be nothing more for us to do. We didn't finish that job, so we have to go through this whole difficult galus. So this is the reconciliation between 400 and 210. But now there's a third number we have to bring in. In Parshas Bo, when the Jews actually leave Mitzrayim, it mentions that the entire Egyptian experience was 430 years. So we have three numbers. The 400 that was declared in the Bris Bein Absarim, the 210 that we actually spent in Mitzrayim, and then the mysterious figure of 430. Where do you get 430? So Chazal say, when it says that it was 430 years in Mitzrayim, it doesn't mean we were in Mitzrayim 430 years. We certainly were not. But it means from the Bris Bein Absarim, when we were told of this Egyptian exile, until the Exodus, is 430 years. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you with mathematical calculations, but let's figure it out. So according to that teaching, the Bris Bein Absarim was 430 years before the Exodus. So we can actually figure out how old Avraham was at the time of the covenant of the parts. Because if it's 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak to Yetzias Mitzrayim, and Avraham at the time of the birth of Yitzchak was 100, the Bris Bein Absarim must have been 30 years before the birth of Yitzchak. Because it's 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak to Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's 430 years from Bris Bein Absarim to Yetzias Mitzrayim. So the Bris Bein Absarim was 30 years before the birth of Yitzchak. And Avraham was 100 when Yitzchak was born. So Avram was 70 years old at the time of the covenant of the parts. Right? Everyone gets that cheshbon. So now we got a real problem. How could Avram have been 70 years old at the time of the covenant of the parts if God didn't even tell him to come to Eretz Israel until the age of 75? So what's going on? He has this covenant with Hashem in the land of Israel at the age of 70. When the beginning of the Parsha, God says, Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave your lands, at the age of 75. It's a real good question. So because of this, Chazal say that Avram actually made an earlier trip to the land of Israel. But then he returned to Haran. Now again, we have to go over something here. Avram's first appearance in the Torah is not in Lech Lecha. It actually is at the end of last week's Parsha, right? Avram is introduced. And it mentions a strange thing, that Terach, the idolater, Avram's father, took Avram and they started traveling to the land of Canaan, which is Eretz Israel. And they left Ur-Kasdim, which was their Babylonian origin, and they got to Haran, which is Syria, somewhere in Syria. And Terach stopped there. He didn't go further. And then we read Lech Lecha that Hashem told Avram to go on. So Chazal actually say what is being described at the end of Parshas Noach is a different trip, meaning to say at some point before Avram was 70, some say when he was 55, he and his father both decided to go to the land of Israel on their own. There was no divine command. Somehow they intuited, now Avram intuited because he felt this was holy. Apparently even Terach had a certain intuition that this was holy. And Avram and Terach and their families are both traveling to Eretz Yisrael. This is not when Avram is 75, that's way before. Terach never makes the trip. Maybe he's too old, maybe he's not well, maybe he changed his mind. But Avram did go. And Avram spent a number of years in Eretz Yisrael. And there was the war of the 4 kings and the 5 kings. And there was the bris bein Absarim when he was 70. At some point, we don't know why, Avram then went backwards. He went back to Haran to be with his father, maybe to bring his father to Eretz Yisrael, maybe just to visit. And apparently when Terach was not going to go, or he couldn't go, when he was 75, Hashem said to Avram, now you have to leave your father and go. You see the point here? The point basically is that this is the second trip Avram is making to Eretz Yisrael. The first trip was without Hashem's command. The second trip is after Avram went back. So a lot of stuff happened on the first trip. It's like a pilot trip. This is the war of the 4 kings and the 5 kings. This is the bris bein Absarim. All of that occurred before Lech Lecha. So the Torah is writing it out of order. This is a classic example of ein mukdam u'me'ucher b'Torah. So the question becomes, what was the motivation for the first trip? I know the second trip is because God told him, Lech Lecha. But the first trip, there was no Lech Lecha. So what was the motivation? Why did Avram and Terach leave their ancestral home of Ur-Kasdim? The answer to that is Chazal's discussion of what Ur-Kasdim means. Now, Ur-Kasdim is the name of a place. Kasdim is Chaldeans. That's simply a term for the Babylonians. But Chazal point out that Ur is a word that means furnace, fire. And when it says Avram was taken out of Ur-Kasdim, it doesn't just mean he left his city, but there was a whole miracle that happened there, the miracle of Ur-Kasdim. What happened? So this is a very famous, well-known midrash. Terach was an idolater, and Terach had an idol store. He would sell idols, and he would put Avram in charge of the store. And Avram already believed in God from the age of 3. And Avram smashed the idols, and then he put an axe in the hand of one of the standing idols. And Terach comes home, or comes to the store, and sees all the merchandise destroyed. It's a big investment. And he says to Avram, why did you smash the idols? And Avram said, I didn't smash the idols. One idol beat up all the other idols. See, that's why he's holding an axe. So Terach says, are you crazy? These idols can't do anything. They can't move. So Avram said, aha. So why do you worship them? Why do you sell them? You yourself told me. They have no power. So inexplicably, we wouldn't think a father would do this to his son, but his father turns him in to King Nimrod. Nimrod, evil guy. Nimrod is the one who made himself an avodah zarah. And certainly he encouraged idolatry. Nimrod says to Avram, I'm giving you one last chance. You either acknowledge avodah zarah, or I'm going to throw you into this fiery furnace, and you're going to be burnt alive. Avram says, I am willing to die for God. Avram is thrown into a fiery furnace. A tremendous miracle happens. Avram is saved. And that's the meaning of Avram leaving Ohr Kasdim. Not just the city Ohr Kasdim, but he was taken out of the furnace of Ohr Kasdim. Now, Avram had a brother. Avram had two brothers, but one particular brother is Haran. Don't confuse Haran with Haran. Haran is the city in Syria where Terach stopped on the way to Eretz Yisrael, and that's where Lavan eventually, that's where Lavan was. That's Haran with a ches. Haran with a hey is Avram's brother. Haran happened to have a very illustrious daughter. Haran is the father of Sarah. So Avraham married, quite literally, his niece. He married his brother's daughter, which halachically is permitted even today. In fact, it's interesting. There's an asymmetry in Jewish laws of incest. And that is, an uncle is allowed to marry a niece. Yeah, that's permitted. But a nephew cannot marry an aunt. It's very interesting that a boy cannot marry his father's sister or his mother's sister. Aunt and nephew is incestuous. Niece and uncle is not incestuous. I'm not sure I know the reason, but that is the halachic structure of this. And Avraham married his niece. But Haran was sitting on the fence. Haran didn't know, should I believe in God or should I believe in avodah zarah? So Haran said, I'll wait and see what happens to Avram. If Avram gets burnt, then I'll stay with the avodah zarah. If Avram is saved, then I know there's only one God. So he sees Avram say, I believe in Hashem. Avram gets thrown into the fire. Avram comes out safe. So Haran becomes a believer. I believe in God too. He gets thrown into the furnace. He gets burnt. Because he really didn't believe until this miracle. So people say, well, wait a second here. Are you saying Haran is a bad guy? I mean, Haran is a Baal Tshuva. I mean, if I believed in avodah zarah, but because I see miracles, I now say there's only one God. That's a righteous thing to do. He did tshuva. So people misunderstand this. It's not that Haran was punished for being a bad guy. Haran was righteous. But his righteousness didn't deserve the supernatural miracle of being saved from a fire. That's all. Meaning, Avram, and the concept is almost paradoxical. In order to merit the miracle of being saved, you have to be willing to die. When Avram said, throw me into the fire, Avram did not know he would come out alive. In fact, Avram probably thought at that point he would die. Avram is willing to die for the honor of God. You're willing to die for the honor of God? God might, not always, but God might miraculously save you. Haran believed in God. When Haran saw Avram being saved, 100% he was a believer. But he was not willing to die for God, because he was only willing to be thrown into the fiery furnace when he figured he would come out okay. But dafka, that's when you're not zocheh to that miracle. So one should not misunderstand this. Haran was a very righteous person. In fact, the Sfarim say, in the zechus of his dying al Kiddush Hashem, he was zocha that his daughter Sarah became the mother of Am Yisrael. So Haran is very high madrega, but he wasn't zocha to that supernatural miracle. So, after the story of Ohr Kasdim, number one, even Terach did tshuva at that point. And Avram and Terach both thought that maybe it's not such a good idea to stick around this place. Because number one, it's a spiritually dangerous place. And number two, it's a physically dangerous place because, you can't expect God is going to do an open miracle every time. So the first move, when Avram was much younger, in other words, he was in Eretz Yisrael at 70, but we don't know how much earlier. I see one medrash says 55, so he had that first trip, he was 55 years old, although there's no textual proof. That was simply, let's get out of here and move to a better environment. And that was the genesis for that move, and Terach went along with him. But Terach stopped at Haran, Avram proceeded, he stayed a number of years, the Bris Ben Absarim and the war, and then he went back, and then at 75, Hashem gave him the Lech Lecha. Okay, so it's important to get a sense of the chronology here, because the Torah is murky and the Torah is not very clear as to the order of events. In fact, there's even a medrash that when Avram was a younger man, he spent 10 years of his life learning with Noach. Noach was still alive. He left, so Avram had a whole bunch of Lech Lechas before the big Lech Lecha, going to different great tzaddikim and learning from them. So now I want to raise a question that the Rishonim ask. The miracle of Ohr Kasdim is such a great miracle, and yet it is not recorded in the Torah. The only remez to this miracle is the place, Ohr Kasdim, which could also be a place. Why is the miracle of Ohr Kasdim not recorded in the Torah? Such a great miracle, yeah.
What does the name Ohr Kasdim translate to?
Well, Kasdim, we know, means the Babylonian people. That's where Avram came from, the Babylon. And Ohr means furnace, the furnace of Kasdim, right? But Ohr was a common name of a lot of ancient cities, maybe because they had iron smelting or whatever it is. So it's only, once we know the story, we can read it into the word Ohr, but you wouldn't know the story there. Now, it's interesting. I'll tell you a little story about this. There was a well-known teacher of Tanakh, a frum woman, Nechama Leibowitz. You may have come across her name. She was a frum woman, but obviously in the yeshiva world, men don't go to women to learn, but whatever it is, the more modern people did learn from her. And again, she was a frum woman, and all of her writings on Chumash are kosher, so to speak. And she was once making a point that we sometimes confuse midrashim with what is in the Chumash itself. Some midrashim are so familiar to us that we really think it's in the Chumash, but really it's not in the Chumash. And she gave an example of Avram and Ohr Kasdim, which is the story is not in the Chumash. It's a medrash. So there was an Israeli general who was secular, who knew Hebrew, and when he was young he had learned in Cheder. So he says in Hebrew, what do you mean it's not in the Chumash? I remember this 60 years ago in Cheder. Of course it's in the Chumash. So she gave him a Chumash and said, find it. So although he was Chiloni, he was secular, but he knew Hebrew, so he's leafing through, looking for the story of Ohr Kasdim. He can't find it. And he says to her, you're giving me a kitzur, you're giving me a summary Chumash. Give me a whole Chumash. He was so sure it was there. But it's not there. Why isn't it there? So I want to share with you a thought of the Maral. That's a really, really beautiful, beautiful thought. Pirkei Avos teaches us something very important. Pirkei Avos teaches us, Kol Ava Shehi Tuluya B'Davar. Any love that depends on an extraneous factor. I love you because you're pretty, because you're kind, because you're smart. I love you because of something. So Pirkei Avos says that love is never guaranteed. Batla davar, when the thing which causes the love is taken away, batla ava, the love is taken away. It's ava tuluya b'davar. But then there is a love that we would call unconditional love.
like the love of a parent for a child. And there we say, Batla Davar, no matter what is taken away, the love does not go away. Right? So there's Ava Hatuluya B'Davar, Batla Davar, Batla Ava, and then there's Ava She'ena Tuluya B'Davar, Batla Davar, Lo Batla Ava. Now, here is what Maral said. If the Torah would have given us the story of Or Kasdim, and then the Torah would have had Hashem tell Avram, leave your land to the land that I promise you, and I will make you a great nation. And those who bless you, I will bless. And those who curse you, I will curse. I would have said, you know why God chose Avraham? Because Avram is good, Avram is devoted, Avram is Amunah, Avram's willing to die. All of that is true. That is why God chose Avram. But you see, if that would have been the reason, that would have made it Ahava Tuluya B'Davar. I love Avram because he's righteous. What's wrong with that? Because what's going to happen in future generations? When we're no longer righteous, we're no longer good, we're sinners. If God chose Avram because of Avram's righteousness, that's Ava Hatuluya B'Davar, Batla Davar, Batla Ava. So instead, Hashem wanted the choice of Avraham to be an unconditional choice. If you read the Chumash, just the Chumash, no Rashi, the Chumash, why did Hashem appear to Avram and make a covenant with him? There is no reason given at all. Of course Hashem had reasons. Hashem didn't just pick a name out of a hat. But the Torah doesn't give a reason. So that the relationship of Hashem to Avram becomes unconditional love. Ava she'ena tluya b'davar. And that's a wonderful thing, because that means no matter how much we sin, no matter how far we go away from Hashem. Now that doesn't mean a freebie. Unconditional love, this is an important idea generally, does not mean there are no boundaries, there are no structures, there's no discipline. A parent may unconditionally love his child. But if you unconditionally love your child, that doesn't mean you let the child do whatever the child wants. If anything, that's a sign you don't really love your child. Either you're lazy or afraid of your child or whatever it is. So yes, in our relationship to God, there is accountability, there's punishments, there's galut, there's churban. Right? Things happen because Hashem wants us to be better and he wants us to be corrected. But it's always coming from love, not hate. And therefore the chiddush of why the Torah does not mention Or Kasdim is it wants to make the love of Hashem for Avram an unconditional love, Ava She'ena Tuluya B'Davar. This is mamish, a marvelous word, which means, yes, God did have a reason. I mean, God didn't choose Avram for no reason. But God didn't want to give a reason to make it an unconditional type of relationship. It's, you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Question. When you talk about God, when you talk about God's love, is it can describe it's not the same as love we have, like love for each other. What does God have?
Well, you know, the whole idea of God and emotion is a very, very, very difficult idea for us to understand, because in some ultimate sense, which we cannot grasp, God himself is not emotion, but nevertheless, both the Torah and the Nevi'im and the Kesuvim and Chazal and the Gemara and the Medrash do describe that God Kaviyachal, we don't fully understand it, has a yearning and a desire to be connected to us. And because everything about God is infinite, just as God's strength is infinite, God's love is infinite as well. So the yearning of Hashem to be connected to us is infinitely greater than anything we could feel, even towards Hashem. Just like in a smaller scale, the love of a parent for a child is greater than the love of a child for a parent. Usually, I'm not going to say it's always that case. But by and large, you know, there's an old Yiddish saying that one parent can take care of 10 kids, but 10 kids cannot take care of one parent. And again, a parent loves, again, I don't mean to apply to any individual case. There are individual cases that might be different, but as a generalization, the love of a parent for a child is stronger. By the way, I'll give you two reasons why that's so. One reason is because Adam Harishon did not have human parents. So the only love Adam could feel towards a human being is the love of a parent to a child. Adam had children. The notion of loving your human parent is a second generation love. So as a result, the first love that came into the world, human love, was the love of a parent to a child. The love of a child to a parent came in only in the second generation, and as a result, that love is considered to be a higher level. Because Adam had the love of a parent to a child. He did not have the love of a child for a parent. Shais already had the love of a child for a parent. So it's set one generation lower. That's one reason. The second reason is a point that Rav Dessler makes. Rav Dessler says, the more you invest in something, the more you work, the more you put in all of your effort, the more precious and beloved something is to you. So Rav Dessler says, parents put in so much work in a child, so they appreciate the child. The child is receiving from the parent. The child is not invested that much in the relationship with the parent. But be it as it may, since Hashem is the ultimate parent, his love for us is infinitely greater than our love for him. Ava she'ena toluya b'davar, an amazing thing, a beautiful thing, that Hashem's relationship with us can never, ever be abrogated. Yeah.
Can we jump to the Parsha Noah and ask a question about that?
Yeah.
From what I understand, the continents were all one continent at one point, and then after the flood, they separated and they became the continents we have today, more or less.
Well, that's again, that is a possibility. Meaning, I'm not going to say for sure it's that way, but one of the explanations of how the animals got to different parts of the world,
Or other people like the Native
or other people,
Americans say-
is that indeed scientists do say, although they don't have the timeline, they have a timeline of millions of years, but they do say what's called continental drift, that the land masses were united and then they were split. So if you're asking me, is that a possibility in Jewish interpretation? The answer is, it is a possibility. I'm not going to say for sure, but we could accept that.
So does that explain how they were, like that? How does the Torah explain like the Aborigines in Australia or the Native Americans in America?
Yeah.
They were separated by seas.
I guess the question you're really asking is, were there human beings who were not wiped out in the flood? I mean, that's really the question.
Yeah.
The Torah seems to describe the idea that the entire human race is descended from Noach and his three sons. That Hashem brought a Mabul. There was no human being actually, even then, there was one guy that did survive for sure, Og. Okay, but Og got extinct. When Og died, he was the last of the giants, so he had no descendants. So Og was the holdout, the only guy who was pre-flood, but there was nobody else that was pre-flood. So the question that was asked is, so what is the suggestion? The American Indians, the Aborigines, did they come from Noach? Or somehow are they pre-flood? And why would they have survived pre-flood if all the land masses were together? It is a very good question. I mean, the simple explanation, but again, scientifically it may be difficult to figure out, is the Aborigines are once again a descendant from Ham, the black nations, the colored races, whatever the proper term is, are descended from Ham. And the Aborigines would be considered to be a branch of that, and they got isolated in Australia when the land masses broke off after the flood. So that would be the simplest explanation. Although, as I say, scientifically, people will have some problems with it. But I don't see a compelling reason why we can't accept the Aborigines are just like any other nation that got descended from Noach's three sons.
But didn't the flood cause the separation of the continents? So That would have happened, the spreading of the Aborigines.
So then you could say the other. Well, yeah, but okay. So whether let's assume it happened as a result of the flood. Okay, now let me ask you this: when that happened, when the continents split, were there human beings on those continents? Probably not, because remember, until the Tower of Babel, the human race all lived in one place. So the dispersion of humanity did not occur at the time of the flood. It occurred many years after the flood. So what that means is we would have to assume you had all of these nations, I don't know how big the population was, and whatever reason, when God split them, so it could be some went, took boats, they could have taken sea voyages to different places at that point. So I think we would have to date all dispersion to those other land masses to the aftermath of the Tower of Babel. Okay, so see, you don't get that impression, because sometimes we think, it just meant that people just walked around somewhere. I mean, they could have taken a ship, they could have gone to America, they could have gone to Australia, they could have done all sorts of things. Yeah.
It's just about Og. Do we know
Yeah.
when was he born? When Og was born?
We do have sources. I cannot tell you. I can check it. We do know when Og died. I mean, Moshe Rabbeinu killed Og, Melech HaBashan, in the 40th year of the Exodus of Mitzrayim.
Yeah, because I don't know. There seems to be perhaps he was very old for sure. He must be like maybe.
It was one of the.
Could be older than Methuselah. Perhaps I don't know. I don't know if he could be somehow older than Methuselah.
That's an interesting. That's actually an interesting thing to check, because Methuselah is considered to be the oldest person, and yet Og might be older.
That's what I was wondering.
Let's check. I can tell you. I can tell you exactly. Not exactly, but almost exactly. Yetzias Mitzrayim occurred in the year 2448 from creation.
The flood was
Now the question is when.
1656.
Say again.
The flood was 1656.
Right. So 1656, and Og died 2488. 2488. No, 2448 is the Exodus, and Og died in the 40th year of the Exodus.
Right.
So it's 2488.
822 years from the Mabul.
From the Mabul. So yeah, right. So the question was. So the question then becomes, how old was he at the time of the Mabul? Yeah. So it's not. You don't have to make him older. At that point, you can say he was 100. In other words, you can make him under Mr. Shelach
Yes.
without having a problem. But that would be the idea. In other words, we know for sure Og's date of death.
Yeah.
So and we know he was alive at the time of the flood. The unknown is we don't know how old he was at the time of the flood. But since from the flood to the Og's death is less than Mr. Shelach, we can add a number of years that'll be under Mr. Shelach, and you're going to be okay. Yeah.
Kind of off the wall, but what could be the explanation of how different Jews look different? Like an Ashkenazi Jew separate, right?
Yeah. That's a very, very good question. Part of it is conversion. Remember the story of the Kuzari, right? So for example, the Kuzari is a philosophical book, but it's based on an actual story, actual event of a Russian tribe, a light-skinned tribe called the Khazars, who converted in the 800s or whatever it is, and there were thousands and thousands of people. Like many say, although I'm going to get criticism because I know people argue with this, but many say Ashkenazi Jews are largely descended from the Khazars who converted, because the natural indigenous complexion that we should have coming from the Middle East would be a darker complexion, like Sephardim and the like. So part of it is conversion. Part of it is even intermarriage, God forbid, improper intermarriage, rape, etc. And part of it might be climactic adaptation, although scientists will say you can't do it over a short number of years, but as you live in certain climates, you adapt in certain ways, and that could result in different features and the like. Yeah.
So is it true that the Kazakhs, that Ashkenazi...
Okay, so this is a very controversial thing. You can Google this and you can do your own research on this. There was a theory that was widely held a number of years ago
that the bulk of Ashkenazi Jews are descendants of the Khazars. In fact, anti-Semites even used to use this as people say Jews are smart. It's not Jews are smart. It's the Russians that are smart. The Khazars are smart, and they just became Jews. Jews are dumb. Okay, whatever. Whatever it does. So anyway, you can actually find books that talk about the Khazars as being genetically the ancestors of most Ashkenazic light-skinned Jews. On the other hand, so please do not send me a hate mail, because people say, how dare I say it? I understand that has been highly, highly criticized, and many people say it's not true. So it's still a matter of discussion to this day. What is the origin of Ashkenazi Jews? Now, one interesting demographical point, though, that's brought out. It is brought out that in the time of the, let's say, in the time of the Gemara, there were many, many more Jews. I mean, Sephardim had a higher population, much bigger population than Ashkenazim. And then what happened over a few centuries was Ashkenazim grew more and more and more and more, and the Sephardim remained constant. Now, Sephardim had much fewer persecutions than Ashkenazim. They didn't have crusades, they didn't have all that stuff. So it's still a bit of a mystery. From when is this explosive growth in Ashkenazi populations making them much larger than Sephardim? So the Khazar origin is one of the explanations for the exponential growth of Ashkenazi Jewry, because Khazars were quite big, like several 100,000 people, etc. But as I say, this is very controversial, and many people, I don't know why people get emotionally angry about this, but in my experience with hate mail over the years, I have discovered that this is I don't know why, this is an emotional thing for people, and people get angry when you make this suggestion. So it is controversial, and you can check it out. But it is a very good question. Okay, well, have a good Shabbos, and.